I was really hoping someone could tell me why we should be. Well, sorry. You can put that one in. Excuse me, sir. Could I ask you a question? Oh, yeah, sure. Excuse me, ma'am.
You want to ask me a question?
That is a really good question.
Excuse me, ma'am. Ma'am?
That requires deep humility to be answered correctly.
If I had $1 for every time somebody's asked me a question, I'd be broke today. I mean...
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I ask
I'll give on the way out.
I just wanted to ask you a question.
If you want to improve, you must be content to be both foolish and stupid.
That's my phone.
This is about you, not me.
Can I get back to you? I'll text you.
Most people don't know this, but he was actually born in Greece.
I was really hoping someone could tell me why believe what science disproves.
Greetings, One at Hill, all of you in Bethel, Waterbury, New Milford, the Valley, and online. We are here at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I know it's a little unusual, but we're continuing our sermon series called The Big Why as we look at those big questions that our friends and neighbors and others are asking about the things of faith and how do we respond. And so today we're looking at that question, why believe what science disputes? Why believe what science questions? That's what we're going today. And we're going to look at Psalm 8, that passage that was read earlier. And we're going to ask the question, how does faith and science interact? And so today I have the blessing of being here with a friend of mine, Ian Hutchinson. He's professor of nuclear physics and engineering here at MIT. He's a plasma physicist. He's written about over 200 papers and a number of books, including Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? And it is such a privilege to be here. Ian, welcome. Tell us, what is a plasma physicist in just 30 seconds?
Plasma is an incredibly hot gas. Mm-hmm. Hotter, actually, the plasmas we make are hotter than the center of the sun. And that's significant because our ultimate objective in fusion research is to bring down the energy source of the sun and stars, which is nuclear fusion reactions, and make them available on Earth, on the human scale, so that we can use them for generating electricity or other energy uses.
It sounds like you have an awful lot of work in that area of science, but you're also a Christian. So how did that happen?
I became a Christian when I was an undergraduate at Cambridge University, and I was baptized on my 20th birthday. I've been a follower of Christ all of my scientific career. In many ways, my Christian understanding and my scientific understanding grew up together. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in their interaction.
Yeah. Well, it's such a blessing to be with you. We're actually on the same board of Vision New England, and what fun to actually chat in a different setting as we look at this question about science and faith. In fact, I'm going to ask you that question. Do you believe that science does disprove Christianity?
No. A quick answer to the question. But the question is a very live one, I think, in our society at the moment. Many people do assume that somehow science and faith are incompatible. But that's actually a fallacy. It's a myth, because modern science as we know it grew up in an atmosphere of Christian faith. Many of the earliest scientists were themselves Christians. And even today, it's not hard for a scientist to believe in Jesus. As I've interacted with scientists and other academics throughout 45 years of my academic career, one of the things I've noticed is that if I go to a university setting and meet with Christians there, scientists are extremely well represented among people of faith in universities. So it's not the case that science somehow sunders people or divides people from the Christian faith.
And you believe in a creator God, because you claim your faith. So is there anything in the field of study, as you've looked at all that you've researched over the years that actually reveals to you this creator God? Are there things that have led you to believe that there is a God as you've studied?
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that science is trying to explain nature naturally. And so naturally enough,
Yes.
science aims to come up with physical explanations of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so we wouldn't necessarily expect science to be in the business of investigating God. But nevertheless, to answer your question, there are many things in science which point to the Creator. If we look at the universe, we think about the laws of nature, we find that they're extraordinarily well tuned to the production of the world as we know it, and in particular to the production of biological life, and hence humans. It's surprising. We live in this unique universe in which the laws of nature are such as to give rise to creatures like us. That doesn't prove there's a God, but it does, I think, point towards God. And I think that if we look for a reason for why the world is the way it is, the idea of there being a creator is one which is very much in tune with what science finds. And so I would say, yes, there are indications, there are pointers to God, but there isn't some kind of scientific proof of the existence of a God. And quite honestly, we shouldn't look for a scientific proof of God, because God isn't a phenomenon in nature, because he is far beyond it. He is the author of nature. So the sorts of indications we look for should be of a different type.
So what would you say to somebody who uses science to say, well, there is no God? How do you respond to that kind of challenge?
Well, people, of course, there are people who make that argument. And I think mostly that argument is based on what I call scientism. It's based on the belief that somehow science is all the real knowledge there is, and anything beyond that is either superstition or opinion or just nonsense. That scientistic view of life is very widespread today, and it undergirds a lot of the arguments that suppose that science rules out God or any kind of spiritual life. But it's a fallacy. There are many things in our life that go beyond what science can describe. Science is an extremely powerful way of investigating the world and gives us enormous important amounts of important information, but it's not all of the knowledge there is. If you think about history, if you think about literature or philosophy or the law, these are all important areas of knowledge that are not addressed by the natural sciences. And so it's just simply a mistake to think that if science doesn't discover God, then that proves there is no God. Science doesn't discover justice, and yet we know there is such a thing as justice. And so the idea that science disproves God, I think, is founded on that sort of fallacy, and I certainly don't accept the arguments.
The psalm that we're looking at today has this vision of the vastness and wonder of who God is, and the smallness of us in some senses. And you have this beautiful verse that says, you know, who is God? Who are we that God is mindful of us? There's something beautiful about that picture that we serve this amazing God, and yet we are little human beings, and yet the scripture goes on and says we were created just a little lower than God. How do you as a scientist understand the spiritual world?
Well, I think there's sort of two aspects of the answer to that question that are called to mind by Psalm 8. On the one hand, the skeptics in this world often say, well, look, if you take the view that science has discovered that we're just a tiny planet in a sort of nondescript galaxy, part of an enormous universe, then somehow, how could it possibly be true that God cares about us? that's one argument which is offered by skeptics, to suppose that there is no God. But the psalm itself calls attention to much the same kind of idea, because the psalmist is wondering and is awestruck by creation and wonders how it could be that God takes care of his people, looks after us, interacts with us. And so the idea that we've discovered that the universe is much bigger than people once thought, which is true, doesn't lead me as a scientist to be more skeptical about the existence of God or about my Christian faith. It just magnifies, in my mind, the wonder of his creation. So what science finds out about the world, to me, is simply emphasizing the wonderful and awe-inspiring nature of creation. And I would say that that's one of the ways in which I personally seek to bring my science and my Christian faith together, is to recognize the glories of the creation and to give thanks to God for those glories.
And yet still hold to the fact that there is a spiritual world
Of course.
that goes beyond the limitations of our understanding simply of nature.
Absolutely. When we're investigating nature and science is pursuing an understanding using its emphasis on reproducible experiments and measurements that give a special type of scientific clarity, it's discovering the ways in which the creation works, the way that God sustains it in a faithful and consistent way, in a way that displays his glory. And to me, that isn't ruling out the spiritual life. In fact, it's pointing towards it. And when we think about the spiritual life, it's important to recognize that, yes, the Bible and the Christian faith has always emphasized that, yes, there's an important physical world in which we live, and there's great consistency and reproducibility in that world. In fact, the Christian faith is one of the things which encouraged people to explore the world in the way that we do in science. But also, there's a recognition that simultaneously with that, there is spiritual, human significance, and indeed significance that goes beyond the mere human.
The vastness of who God is and his kindness to us, that you are experiencing and learning about as you dig into nature, doesn't it capture more wonder for you?
Yes, it does. I would also say that there's important ways in which my Christian faith has been a support to my activities as a scientist. This is another aspect of the ways in which I think it's a terrible mistake to suppose that science and Christianity are somehow always at war. That's not the case. When you're a scientist, there's much more than merely what you learn in lectures and in scientific textbooks involved, because science is, after all, a human project. And so the kinds of things that I, as a scientific leader or professor, need to be a successful scientist include all the kinds of things that are to do with human interactions, leadership, teamwork, team building, and so on. These are the kinds of things that you don't learn in the lecture hall, you learn in life. And they're, in my case, they're the kinds of things that I would think, insofar as I have skills in those areas, these skills were developed much more by my Christian involvement, my fellowship, my Bible studies, and other aspects of my Christian faith, than they were by the scientific training that I've had. So I certainly see the interaction between my Christian faith and my science as being something that's very, very constructive, as opposed to being some kind of contradiction.
Just to take a question slightly tangentially, verse 6 of Psalm 8 says that God gave human beings charge of everything in creation, putting all things under their authority. Now, that can be a subject that gets a little challenging amongst Christians with different opinions, but what would be your sense of the responsibility that we have as humans for the world in which God has given us?
Yeah, well, so in Genesis 1, God gives humankind dominion over the earth. And that's an important observation about our relationship to the rest of creation. We are the dominant species and we have great power. And what science does is gives us even greater power. So that is one aspect of authority. But with authority comes responsibility. And in Genesis 2, God gives Adam the garden and he's told to keep it and to till it. And that's the responsibility. So if, as Christians believe, God has given us that sense of authority and dominion over the earth, he's also given us tremendous responsibility to watch over it, to till the ground, to keep it. And as science develops greater technology, and we as humans have grown in numbers and in our power to influence the earth, I would say that our responsibility has become even greater. And so I think there's a very important balance to be struck in our Christian faith between dominion, authority, if you like, and responsibility. And I think sometimes it's the case that the Christian church has perhaps emphasized one at the expense of the other. But I think today there's a growing realization that that responsibility aspect of things is something extremely important for us to take into account, to have a thoroughgoing understanding of. And by the way, the scriptures are a tremendous resource in that respect. So if you think in terms of Christian and Jewish teaching about the Sabbath, about Jubilee and so forth, what you discover is Sabbath isn't just rest for humans, it's rest for the earth. And so there is embedded in our faith a sense of respect for creation that should inspire us to take that responsible attitude.
Let's talk about some of those less comfortable conversations. I mean, we hear enough about people saying, well, there's a tension between the Bible and science. And how do you respond to some of those questions and challenges that get raised?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's important not to be simplistic about these things. Clearly, there are sometimes tensions. And although I would say in my own life, I have not really experienced some overwhelming tensions, there have been puzzles on the way. And I don't claim to have answers for all of the questions that might come up about the relationship between science and faith, even though generally I find I've thought about these things and I've worked through them. I think particularly in the question of the relationship between the Bible and science, it's important to realize both what science is, but also, in a certain sense, how we should approach the Bible. I mean, for one thing, it's clear that the Bible is full of different types of literature. You know, it has psalms, songs, history, theology, it has letters, it has biography, and all kinds of different literature.
Yeah.
But one type of literature that is not in the Bible is scientific literature, because science didn't exist when the Bible was written. So I think it's terribly important to realize that it would not be sensible for us to go to the Bible and try to find science there. And one of the things that's important to recognize is that important qualification. So, for example, there have been people over history who've tried to derive science from the Bible, and this has usually led to foolish misinterpretations. If you think about the question of whether the Earth orbits the Sun or the Sun orbits the Earth, which was a very live question at the beginning of the 17th century, there were those people who, when Galileo was advocating the orbiting of the Earth as opposed to the sun, who said, oh, I can read here in Psalm 104 that it says the Earth is firmly established and cannot be moved. Therefore, it can't possibly be the case that the Earth orbits the sun because the Earth is fixed and cannot move. Well, that's a way of interpreting the Psalm which is contrary to the way the Psalm is meant. The Psalm is actually describing the appearance as opposed to the scientific background of whether of that particular question. And so nowadays, of course, Christians throughout the world don't have any big problem with the idea that the Copernican system, solar system, is actually a scientific fact. And so our interpretation of that psalm has been guided by understanding both what science tells us and also what is the correct interpretation of the scriptures in that passage.
You know, I've talked a little bit about Jesus and how Jesus becomes a little challenging in this question of science with the natural order and the way that things work, and yet a Jesus who is resurrected, that's the heart of our faith. How do you understand that?
Yeah, my book, which is called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles, actually has a subtitle which is an MIT professor answers questions on God and science. Actually, the book is all about a range of questions, but this question about miracles is a very important one because the heart of our faith is that Jesus rose again from the dead on the third day, and his victory over sin is, of course, what brings us salvation, and that reality is very important. So if in fact miracles were impossible, as some people believe, then our Christian faith would be in difficulty. How do I square that? Well, the idea that science disproves miracles is founded on a belief that somehow the laws of nature are inviolable, that there can never be any different behavior than what happens in accordance with the laws of nature. I don't think that's true, and I don't think it's proved by science. What Hebrews says is that he, God the Son, sustains the universe by his word of power. So I see God upholding the universe moment by moment, and if he did not continue to do so, the universe would cease to exist. And the laws of nature that folks like me discover are a discovery of the normal way that God upholds the universe. But those laws of nature do not compel God, even though God is very faithful, and we can see his faithfulness in the way that the consistency that he sustains the world. Nevertheless, he is not bound by that consistency in some kind of chains by which he cannot influence the world. And in fact, on the contrary, I believe there's strong evidence that miracles do happen. It's not scientific evidence because miracles are not reproducible events that can be investigated easily by science. But I certainly believe that miracles do take place, and that an understanding of the Christian perspective of creation is consistent with modern science in that sense.
So in essence, what you're saying is God isn't limited just by what we can see.
That's right. That's right.
So I'd like us just to imagine for a moment that we have a teenager with us. That teenager grew up in the church, they've heard all about God and the Bible throughout their life, but they're also learning stuff in school that's beginning to create a whole bunch of questions, and they're doubting whether what they learnt growing up and in church is really true. What might you say to that young person?
Well, one thing I would say straight away is that doubt is not necessarily a bad thing. In this following sense, the way we think as humans is to ask questions about the things we think we know, and to work out an understanding of that. And doubt is part of that process. Jesus treated doubt very gently, as I read the New Testament. And so when someone tells him that he has doubts about things, Jesus is very gracious towards that. So that's the first thing. Doubt is not such a bad thing in itself. But what we have to recognize is that we need to move from that doubt to a more trusting relationship. When we talk about faith, faith isn't necessarily just belief in certain propositions. When we're talking about the Christian faith, the faith we're talking about is something that is trust and something that is also a sense of allegiance and faithfulness. And these are the things which God is calling us to. In fact, our relationship with God is not primarily an intellectual relationship. The relationship that God calls us to, I believe, is much more the relationship of a person, of two people. So I think God calls us into a personal relationship with Him that is lived out by prayer and worship and daily life. And so one way to approach that is to recognize that that personal commitment is what God is calling us to. Of course, there are puzzles in life. Of course, you don't necessarily understand all of the relationships between God and science. Neither do I. I've spent time thinking about them, and I've worked them out to a point where I think I have a consistent position on this. But even if you are encountering people in your world who dismiss Christianity as superstition and so on and so forth, they don't have all of the answers either. And so I would say that you need to look to those whom you respect, listen to what they say, and explore widely in an atmosphere of trusting God and recognizing His importance in your life. And if that's the case, you will find that there is a consistency. I believe you will find that there is a consistency, and that there is a God who is real, who has revealed Himself through Jesus Christ and continues to be active in the world. And that's my experience.
That's wonderful. It reminds me of the scripture that says, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. That Father so concerned for His Son. And if that could be the cry of our own hearts, Lord, with the limits of what I understand, help me to believe, help me to trust, help me to walk with You. Ian, it's been such a blessing to be at MIT and to be with you today. Thank you so much for sharing from your heart, from your experience. There is a challenge to us as we look at this question. It's so easy to assume that science has disproved all the things of our faith and yet not take the time to really explore, what is science saying? Are there leaps of understanding going on here? And what is faith saying? Who is this God? Do I believe that He is way bigger than what I can simply see and understand? Will I cry with the man, Lord, help me believe. I believe, help me in my unbelief. So my question to you today is, are you trying to limit God to what you can see? Or are you willing to trust that He is greater than you can imagine and go on that journey of relationship and exploration and then call others, invite others into that same journey of discovery that you are on? We serve a great God, and He is the one that we put our hope and trust in.